there is no border crisis. I asked this commenter for a source to back up her claim that Biden had completely open borders leading to an immigration crisis that only Trump could save us from. And she came back with this, which is a masterclass in Republican fear-mongering and how a lack of critical thinking is the main reason so many people were convinced to vote for a known liar, grifter, and felon who says we should murder people and is currently so riddled with dementia he can barely string a sentence together. I'm going to address every point on this blatant propaganda and show you how Republicans have manufactured a fake national emergency for their own gain, because, again, there is no border crisis. The very first thing I want to point out here is that this fact sheet has a whole lot of numbers with no context or explanation, which is a very common technique in propaganda. Numbers sound official. If you can confidently say a number, it can sound really scary. But numbers mean nothing without context. We see here 109,000 encounters in 2022. Is that a lot? Is it more or less than we had in 2021? Is it more or less than other countries? Were any of them dangerous? Were any of them legal? For that matter, what does the word encounter even mean here? You don't have any idea what it means to have 109,000 encounters, but the implication they want you to have is that because they're telling you this number, it's a bad number. But when they don't give you context, you should be suspicious. Next, I'll point out that this says northern border crisis, referring to our border with Canada, and especially this little stretch right here. But most of the statistics here include numbers from all borders. That should make you suspicious right off the bat. It's a clear sign this document is massaging numbers to fit a narrative. If there really is a northern border crisis, and again, there is no border crisis, they should be able to back it up with numbers from the northern border. But bigger numbers look scarier, and most Republican voters aren't going to be looking at this critically, so they're not going to notice the sources don't match. The truth is, the northern border accounts for about 5% of our total border encounters, so I could honestly end this video right here, because if this crisis they're screaming about is only 5% of the total, it should be obvious to you that there is no border crisis. I won't end it here though, because this thing is completely packed with obvious bullshit. Now, at the bottom here, there's a bunch of blatant fear-mongering in the form of 6 stories of illegal aliens who committed crimes. We can throw all this out because it's completely irrelevant. See my previous video, Illegal Immigrants You're Being Lied to. A collection of 6 anecdotes means nothing, because for every report you present of an illegal immigrant committing a crime, I can easily find you a dozen cases of that same crime committed by a US citizen. In fact, I can probably find you a dozen crimes committed by a straight, white Christian man whose name starts with the letter K. As my previous video points out, illegal immigrants commit crime at a lower rate than US citizens. So these 6 stories don't mean there's a crisis. Cross them off. Next, let's look at this one. 9,000 pounds of fentanyl seized. Wow, that's scary. Except, what does that mean exactly? I'm not a fentanyl expert, and neither are you, so let's try to figure this out. What does 9,000 pounds look like? Was this 9,000 people with 1 pound stuffed in their pockets, or one guy with a truck? You can rent a 15-foot U-Haul truck this weekend and throw 6,000 pounds in without risking losing your deposit. And a base model Ford F-250 can tow a 17,000-pound trailer. So over a period of 4 years, Border Patrol seized an amount of fentanyl that can be carried by one guy with a truck. Is that a crisis? Also, is this a lot of fentanyl on a national scale? Maybe we should look at the total amount of fentanyl coming into the country. This 9,000 pounds is what was seized between ports of entry. That means not at an official border crossing. And it turns out over 90% of fentanyl intercepted by Border Patrol is at official border checkpoints. So wait, then why are they telling us this 9,000 number and not the much bigger, scarier total? Because most of that fentanyl was in vehicles driven by US citizens. Immigrants had nothing to do with it. And in fact, they don't tell us who is carrying this 9,000 pounds. For all we know, that could be citizens as well. Either way, if you were to magically stop every single non-citizen from entering the country, that would barely make a dent in the fentanyl problem, because immigrants aren't where it's coming from, and there is no border crisis. So we cross that one off. Now, we have 650,000 criminals roaming free in our country. That's a statistic I see thrown around a lot by pundits, and I'm honestly surprised nobody ever questions it, because it doesn't make any sense at all when you think about it for more than 2 seconds. Republican politicians want you to believe there are over 500,000 rapists and murderers roaming free, but ICE knows about them? If ICE knows who they are, what they've done, and where they've gone, why aren't they rounding them up? I mean, they've obviously got the time to zip tie children and harass innocent people at their jobs, so why are they leaving all those bad criminals alone? The answer is here, the non-detained docket. What even is this, and why aren't you asking yourself that before you freak out about the big number? The non-detained docket is the list of all illegal immigrants who are not currently detained specifically by ICE. That means this number includes people who are currently in prison for their crimes, not roaming free, and people who are awaiting trial for pending charges. If those people are roaming free, it's because a judge has decided that they're not a threat to the public and not a flight risk. And remember, they're also innocent until proven guilty. But you know who else is included in this 650,000? Anyone with a criminal record. That means anyone convicted of any crime at all, no matter what it was, even if they've already served their time. If they served their time, then they should be roaming free. That's how jail works. And criminal record doesn't mean dangerous criminal. These are people who got caught shoplifting, or failed to pay a traffic ticket, or got a DUI, or had one too many and did something stupid in front of a cop. Sure, there are also violent charges included here, but if someone on this docket was convicted of a violent crime and hasn't served their punishment, they are currently in jail and not a threat to anyone. Incidentally, do you know how many US citizens have a criminal record? It's about 1 in 3, 33%. So yes, you are constantly surrounded by criminals, but most of them won't hurt you, and almost none of them are immigrants. This number means nothing. These are not people you need to be afraid of. Next up, 55,000 arrests. Any first-year student of crime or statistics can tell you that number of arrests has very little to do with criminality or risk to the public, because all it means is that enforcement is up, and officers are finding more reasons to arrest people. It doesn't mean any more crimes are being committed. As an example, in this current period of drastically increased ICE activity, a mind-blowing 65% of people taken by ICE had no criminal convictions at all, and 93% had no violent convictions. The number of people taken in has nothing to do with how many crimes they've committed. Now, if we want to look at arrests anyway, this 55,000 is 0.2% of the total arrests made in this country in the same time period. That's 0.2%. So if you're worried about being the victim of a crime, you should really be looking at your fellow citizens that make up that other 99.8%. Because, once again, see my previous video. Immigrants commit crimes at a lower rate than US citizens. Now that we've addressed all the really obvious deception, let's look at what's left of this northern border crisis. And again, there is no border crisis. Encounters at the northern border increased by 600% in 2024 compared to 2021. And apprehensions in the Swanton sector, again, this little strip right here, are up more than 5,000%. Anytime you see numbers this big, you should be suspicious, because it's literally impossible for changes like that to happen organically. If there was a 600% increase in encounters along all our borders, that would mean about 900 million people tried to enter the country, or 2.5 times the population of the United States. Obviously, there are not that many people trying to get into the US, so what made encounters at the Swanton sector increase so much? To understand that, we have to talk about Title 42. Title 42 is a public health regulation that allows the CDC to prevent people from coming into the country and immediately expel them to protect public health. Normally, under our immigration law, people who come into the country as refugees or asylum seekers are allowed to stay here while their petition is being processed. But you may remember there was a little public health incident in 2020, and that's when President Trump invoked Title 42, meaning that anyone entering the country illegally through our southern border would be immediately expelled. Why just the southern border? Because the point of this was to limit the spread of COVID-19. And prior to 2020, the northern border accounted for about 0.5% of Border Patrol encounters. Doing these Title 42 expulsions requires a huge increase in manpower and resources. and the border between the US and Canada is massive. So focusing on the southern border was a much more efficient use of resources that were already very limited because, again, COVID. Also, we had an existing agreement with Canada, the Safe Third Country Agreement, that meant most people entering at an official border checkpoint would already automatically be sent back to Canada. With Title 42 taking effect, suddenly immigrants who had resources had a huge incentive to hop on a plane to Canada and cross the border from there at an unofficial crossing. If they were caught there, they'd be allowed to stay while they applied for asylum. As you might imagine, this led to a huge increase in the previously very low number of encounters at the northern border. The new number is still very low because only people who could afford a plane ticket could do this, and most people seeking refuge in our country don't have those resources. But because the number started out so small, it doesn't take that many people to create a very scary sounding 600% increase. And what about that even scarier 5,000% increase in the Swanton sector? In the Swanton sector, there is a road called Roxham Road, which was a very well-known and well-traveled unofficial crossing point. So naturally, most of the people who tried to enter from Canada came to Roxham Road, and that sector saw a larger percent increase. Roxham Road was closed in 2023, but people still crossed the border in that general area. And another thing happened that pushed the number even higher. The US and Canada changed the Safe Third Country Agreement so that unofficial crossings were no longer an exception, and anyone crossing at any point along the border could be immediately sent back. And why would this increase encounters? In Border Patrol lingo, an encounter is every time Border Patrol encounters any person trying to enter the country. So if a couple with 3 young children cross over and get caught and remain in the US, that's 5 encounters. But if that family gets kicked out and gets caught trying to cross over a second time, that's a total of 10 encounters. Number of encounters is not the same as number of people, and modifying the Safe Third Country Agreement immediately increased the number of encounters because if you drop desperate people off just over the border, they're just going to try to cross again. This also accounts for a huge increase in encounters at the southern border, so keep that in mind when you see any statistics that include the COVID and Title 42 era. Incidentally, this sheet uses the word apprehensions, which means something different, but I had a look at the raw data from US Customs and Border Protection, and what they're actually comparing here is encounters. But the important thing to note here is that these big, scary percentage increases are meaningless, because they just reflect the fact that a small number of people, the very few who have enough resources to buy a plane ticket, have been diverted from the southern border to the northern border. It is not an increase in the total number of immigrants, and there is no border crisis. Finally, there's this 2 million gotaways number, which also goes back to Title 42. It takes a lot of manpower and money to expel people from the country. So while Title 42 was in effect, resources were diverted away from catching people so that we could remove people quickly. That's why more people got away. And yes, it did make things a little more dangerous because we weren't able to screen those people and remove the ones who were actually dangerous criminals. However, I'm still going to mark this as irrelevant because you can see here that the number spiked while Title 42 was in effect, and as soon as it ended, that number plummeted and returned to nearly pre-pandemic levels before Biden's presidency even ended, as we went back to our usual routine of catching people, making sure they're not dangerous, then releasing them to wait for their asylum hearings. So now we understand why, even when Biden was begging Congress for support with border reform during his presidency, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives didn't do a single thing to stop this so-called border crisis. They knew better than anyone that there is no border crisis. What they did have was a very convenient set of inflated numbers they could use to stir up panic in a poorly informed voter base. Numbers that didn't reflect any actual threat to public safety. So they fought Biden's efforts to close these loopholes because they knew it would help them in the 2024 election. In poll after poll, Trump voters have listed immigration and the economy as the 2 biggest issues driving their choice. And just speaking from my own experience, when I ask commenters why they voted for Trump, immigration is overwhelmingly the reason they give. Fear is a powerful emotion, and Republicans harness that in their propaganda because it's one of the few things they have to convince people. They know their policies are terrible for the working class, damaging to public health and safety, and catastrophic for the economy. But they do offer an easy scapegoat for people's fears. Fears of crime, of losing power and prestige, and of losing community ties. Look, here are these people who don't look like you and don't believe the same things you do. Aren't they scary? Aren't they dangerous? Aren't they destroying your way of life? Inevitably, I'm going to get comments from people who say, oh, so you think we should just open the floodgates and let anyone into our country? I just want to emphasize that I'm in no way saying that, even though it's kind of pointless to say that because the people who leave those comments already left them and scrolled away from this video about 7 minutes ago. I believe we do need solid immigration enforcement, but we also need to give people a lot more legal ways to enter the country, because right now it is very, very difficult. The entire reason that we have so many people crossing the borders illegally and gaming the system is because that is the only route available to most of them to get into the country. Unless you are fabulously wealthy in your home country, like serious money, several times the median income in the US, chances are pretty good there is literally no legal way for you to get into the US. If they had more legal ways to get in, they could do that. They could go through the proper checks and screenings, the proper procedures to make sure we're not letting dangerous people in. And they wouldn't have to go sneaking in through the back door. Changing our immigration procedures wouldn't change the number of immigrants in the US, but it would change the number of illegal immigrants. And that's the thing Republicans always say, right? We love immigrants, we just want them to follow the rules. Well, then give them rules that are actually possible for them to follow, or else admit that you just don't like brown people. And you might still believe that immigration in general is bad for the country, that we should restrict entry even more, and that's okay. That would mean we've got a difference of opinion, but it's one that can be reasonably discussed and shouldn't affect whether we can get along. The problem comes when you let that fear of the other, the fear of the scary outsider lurking around every corner, overwhelm your other values and your common sense. Immigration is an issue, but is it enough of an issue to justify voting for a felon? For an abuser? For a man who was described by Jeffrey E. himself as a narcissist and the worst person he's ever met? Is it worth voting for someone supported by the Heritage Foundation, an organization that wants to eliminate trans people and keep women barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen? Because if you think immigrants pose enough of a threat for you to justify voting for all that, then your priorities are seriously screwed up, and you must really, really hate brown people to compromise your morals to oppose them. Because, and I cannot state this enough, there is no border crisis.